Have you ever caught yourself saying, I already know that, and then secretly wondered why nothing in your life actually shifted? Maybe someone offered advice and you smiled politely, convinced it was old news. Maybe you skimmed through a book because the ideas felt familiar. Maybe a mentor tried to guide you, but you tuned out halfway through, certain you were already ahead of the lesson. Here's the uncomfortable reality. There's a silent chasm between information and transformation, between recognizing the words and embodying the truth. If you've ever felt trapped while fully aware of what you should be doing, this story is for you. Because there once lived a man who believed he had mastered knowledge, until life exposed how little he truly understood. Listen closely. In a kingdom celebrated for its academies and towering libraries, there lived a young intellectual named Mark. By 25, he had devoured more books than scholars twice his age. He quoted philosophers effortlessly, recited poetry from memory, argued theology with precision, and untangled complex theories as if they were child's play. To the city, he was brilliant, but behind his back, people said something else. Mark knows everything, except how to listen. When others spoke, he waited impatiently for his turn. When teachers offered guidance, he cut them off. Yes, yes, I've read that already. When elders shared hard-earned wisdom, he smiled thinly and dismissed it as recycled stories. His mother once told him softly, knowing a river's name doesn't mean you understand its current. Mark laughed. Mother, I've studied rivers extensively. I know them inside and out. But here's what he didn't know. His life was barren. For all his learning, he had no peace. For all his reading about loyalty, he had no true friends. For all his research on happiness, he woke each morning with a quiet emptiness in his chest. People didn't feel inspired by him, they felt drained. Yet Mark refused to see the pattern. In his mind, the solution was obvious. More books, more theories, more knowledge. What he never considered was this effect. He didn't need more information. He needed humility. He never understood that his favorite phrase, I already know that, was slowly turning into iron bars around his own heart. One crisp autumn morning, Mark heard whispers of a master gardener who lived on the outskirts of the kingdom. People claimed he could coax blossoms from frozen soil and make fruit appear out of season. They spoke of him with quiet reverence. Mark rolled his eyes. Romantic nonsense. I've studied horticulture. I know how plants grow. Still, curiosity tugged at him, not to learn, but to expose the exaggeration. He would prove this master was nothing more than an ordinary man inflated by rumor. He found the gardener in a modest plot of land, kneeling beside a pond, carefully placing stones as if each one mattered. Master, Mark called confidently, I've been told you teach trees to thrive. I've studied botany in depth. Perhaps I can offer you some refined insight. The old man looked up, his eyes calm. Would you like some tea? Mark stiffened. I didn't come for tea. I came to discuss advanced cultivation methods. I've read extensively. Sit, the master said gently. Reluctantly, Mark lowered himself onto a wooden stool. The master began to pour tea into Mark's cup. The liquid rose to the brim. He kept pouring. Tea spilled over the edge. He kept pouring. It streamed across the table and dripped onto the soil below. Stop! Mark leapt to his feet. The cup is full. It can't hold any more. The master slowly set down the teapot and met Mark's eyes. Yes, he said quietly. The air seemed to thicken. Your mind is like this cup. You arrived overflowing, crowded with theories, crammed with conclusions, saturated with I already know. Tell me, how can anything new enter when there is no space? The words hit harder than any debate Mark had ever lost. For once, no clever reply came. Silence pressed against him. But I've studied for years, he murmured. I've learned so much. I know so many things. And for the first time in his life, those words sounded uncertain, even to him. The master's smile carried a quiet sorrow. You are familiar with many ideas, he said softly, but have you truly grasped even one? Mark stood frozen as tea dripped from the table's edge. A strange feeling crept into his chest, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Confusion, doubt, and beneath it, a sharp, rising fear that he had spent years collecting facts while missing their meaning. Teach me, he said at last, his voice unsteady. Please. The master gave a small nod. Then we begin the only way possible. You must empty your cup. He rose and motioned for Mark to follow him through the garden paths. I will show you 3 gardens, he said. Each reveals the difference between possessing information and possessing wisdom. They arrived at the first garden. It was immaculate. Stone plaques stood beside every plant. Wooden boards displayed careful sketches and precise notes. Everything was cataloged, labeled, categorized. This, the master explained, is the garden of knowledge. Observe the order. Every detail recorded, every name preserved. I can describe each plant perfectly without ever kneeling in the dirt. Mark's eyes lit up. Yes, this is remarkable. Clear structure, accurate classification, solid theory. Look again, the master said quietly. Mark leaned closer. The leaves were brittle, the petals sagged, the soil was dry and cracked. Despite the flawless organization, the garden was dying. Information alone, the master said, is like a flower pressed between pages. It keeps its shape, but it loses its life. A chill ran through Mark. They continued walking. The second garden was the opposite. Chaos everywhere. Shovels abandoned mid-path. Buckets overturned. Soil scattered across the walkway. Constant movement filled the air. This is the garden of action, the master said. A young apprentice darted past them, sweating, digging holes at random, uprooting plants only to relocate them moments later, splashing water without rhythm or thought. He never stopped moving. He works tirelessly, Mark observed. Yes, the master replied. But watch closely. The apprentice planted without studying the soil, watered without checking the roots, pruned without understanding the seasons. The result? Some plants drowned, others withered. Many were damaged beyond repair. Activity is not the same as understanding, the master said calmly. Movement is not the same as growth. Mark swallowed. For years he had lived in the first garden, collecting labels. And in moments of ambition he had rushed into the second, acting without depth. For the first time, he began to wonder what the third garden might reveal. He's diligent, Mark remarked. Yes, the master replied, but he doesn't understand the reason behind what he does. He imitates methods without grasping their foundation. He is constantly in motion, yet nothing truly flourishes because his effort has no wisdom guiding it. They walked on in silence until they reached the third garden. Mark stopped breathing for a moment. It was breathtaking. Every plant stood vibrant and strong. Colors blended in stunning harmony. The air carried a richness that felt almost sacred. Nothing was forced, nothing was frantic, yet everything was alive. This, the master said quietly, is the garden of understanding. Here, knowledge and action are no longer separated. Principles are lived, lessons are embodied. What was once information becomes identity. He knelt and scooped up a handful of soil. Tell me, Mark, do you know what soil contains? Of course, Mark answered quickly. Minerals, organic material, moisture, air, decomposed matter. The master raised his hand. You know the terminology. Now close your eyes. Place your hands in the earth. Mark hesitated, then slowly obeyed. His fingers pressed into the cool ground. The soil shifted gently beneath his touch. Feel it, the master whispered. Not with your intellect, with your senses, with your attention. What is it telling you? Mark's instinct was to list properties, but something stopped him. He stayed still. He noticed the texture, soft yet structured, the faint warmth beneath the surface, the subtle dampness, the quiet pulse of life hidden in darkness. It's alive, he breathed. I can feel it. The master nodded. Now you are no longer reciting, you are experiencing. That is the difference. Knowledge lives in the mind. Understanding lives in you. The master's voice softened. Mark, you've studied love. Yes, Mark replied. Extensively. Have you ever truly felt it? Silence. You've analyzed peace, written notes about it, debated its philosophy, but tell me, do you possess it? Silence again. The master's eyes did not accuse, they revealed. This is the line most people never cross, he said. Recognizing a path is not the same as walking it. Studying water is not the same as drinking when you're dying of thirst. A man can memorize everything about fire and still shiver in the cold. The words settled heavily. For the next 30 days, the master continued, you will practice something harder than study. Whenever you hear a lesson, even one you've heard 100 times, you will not say, I already know. He paused. You will ask instead, do I live this? Have I embodied it? Or have I simply stored it like a coin in my pocket? He looked straight into Mark's eyes. Empty your cup, not by discarding knowledge, but by letting it change you. That evening, Mark did something unfamiliar. He admitted to himself that he did not understand. The next morning, a neighbor spoke to him about patience. The old Mark would have replied instantly, "I've read Seneca. I understand patience." But he caught himself. Instead, he said, "Can you tell me how you practice it when you're frustrated?" The question felt awkward, humbling, but also freeing. Days passed, then weeks. He reopened books he once skimmed with arrogance. This time he slowed down. He chose one principle at a time and lived with it. When he read about gratitude, he didn't underline the definition. He practiced it. He didn't rush ahead. When he reached a chapter on gratitude, he closed the book and lived there for a week. No new pages, no new theories, just practice. When an elder repeated a story Mark had heard years before, he didn't cut in. He listened as if it were brand new and discovered meanings he had been too arrogant to notice. Slowly, people began to see it. Mark asked more than he answered. He listened longer than he spoke. He admitted, "I don't know," without shame. And then something extraordinary happened. Peace stopped being a concept and became a sensation. Conversations stopped being competitions and became connections. One afternoon, a young student approached him. "Mark, I've studied 12 books on meditation, but my mind is still restless. Can you teach me?" The old Mark would have launched into a lecture, quoting Buddhist texts, referencing neuroscience, stacking theories like trophies. But the new Mark paused. "I'm still learning too," he said honestly. "Let's sit together. I've realized that understanding the method and actually sitting in silence are worlds apart." The student's face softened with relief. For the first time, someone wasn't speaking above him. Someone was walking beside him. 30 days later, Mark returned to the garden. The master was in the same place, beside the pond, adjusting stones with quiet precision. "Master," Mark said, "I see it now. I believed information was strength, but wisdom, that's real strength. And wisdom is born when knowledge is lived, when ideas become habits, when I know becomes I am." The master's eyes shone. "Would you like some tea?" Mark laughed, deeply, freely. "Yes," he said, "this time my cup is ready." And here's the truth. Mark's story isn't just his. It's yours. It's mine. We are surrounded by endless information, articles, podcasts, books, opinions. Never in history have we known so much. And yet, so many of us feel empty, anxious, disconnected, because information fills the mind. Only lived truth fills a life. So the next time you hear yourself say, "I already know that," pause and ask the harder question. Do you live it? How often have we brushed off advice with, "I know that already"? We hear reminders about working out, fixing our relationships, managing money, improving ourselves. We know we should eat better. We know we should be more patient. We know we should save and invest. But knowing without doing is just mental entertainment. Here's the truth most people avoid. A beginner who practices one principle daily is far ahead of the expert who memorizes 1,000 and applies none. So try this for the next 7 days. First, when you hear advice, even something you've heard 100 times, don't dismiss it. Instead ask, am I living this, or have I only stored it? Second, pick one thing you already know you should be doing, just one, and commit to it for 7 days. Not flawlessly, just faithfully. If you know you should practice gratitude, do it for a week. If you know your body needs movement, move for a week. If you know you should call your mother, call her for 7 days straight. Small action, real consistency. Third, adopt a beginner's mindset. Even in areas where you feel experienced, approach them as if you're new. Drop the assumption that you've mastered it. Watch what opens up, because when you empty your cup, something powerful happens. The advice that once sounded repetitive suddenly hits differently. The lesson you used to ignore begins to reshape you. The wisdom you thought you possessed finally becomes part of your character. You don't lack access to information. You lack embodiment. Real change begins the moment knowledge stops being something you collect and starts being something you live. If this made you notice the gap between what you know and how you actually live, pass it on to someone else. We all need the reminder. Before you scroll away, pause for a second. What's one habit you know would improve your life, but you keep postponing? Write it down. Say it out loud. Own it. Let's hold each other accountable, not just to collect ideas, but to live them. Growth doesn't happen in the mind alone. It happens in action. I'll return soon with another story to challenge you and stretch you. Until then, remember this. Empty your cup, not to erase what you've learned, but to let it reshape you. because the wisest person in any room isn't the one with the most facts. It's the one who listens deeply enough to be changed.